Bingo. We have today Tim Seibles, distinguished poet. He's the author of 6 collections of poetry: Buffalo Head Solo, Hurdy-Gurdy, Hammerlock, Body Moves. Most recently, we've been so fortunate to have Tim with us at Etruscan for his most recent 2 collections, which are Fast Animal, which was National Book Award finalist, 2012, and One Turn Around the Sun. And we're now looking forward to a real landmark or touchstone in a poet's career, which is the new and selected poems. And so, Tim, I want to talk a little bit, ask you a little bit about that process of putting together a book. You know, poems are usually written perhaps discreetly, but at one point we start thinking in terms of a longer format. And how does that work for you, Tim?
Well, I guess I'm always working on a book, but it's certainly not obvious in any way until pretty late in the process. So, for example, it takes me about, on average, up to this point, around 5 years between books, something like that, sometimes a little more. And so I'm just writing poems. I'm just writing poems, and, I love to write, so I'm writing. But usually during any particular period, certain kinds of themes are going to emerge, whether you're intending them to or not. Your mind is in a particular place for this period of time. And so the poems may begin in various ways to speak to each other. Sometimes you'll get an outlier, or you'll write a poem that may not fit anywhere in a book, but oftentimes you'll begin to see certain obsessions, may be too strong a word, but certain fascinations that are driving a number of poems into being. And then you start to see perhaps a dialogue between the poems, and maybe in the 3rd year or thereabouts, you start to see a kind of narrative arc in the book. You start to see an arc, like, oh, this seems to be an early poem, and this poem seems to be heading toward the closing. It's all intuitive, of course. I don't have any rule book that I use, but you begin to just have a sense that there's a certain movement from certain poems to certain other poems. And that's how it begins for me. I begin to see patterns and themes and connections between poems. And then if you're lucky, you spend a good bit of time. I think I've probably talked to you about this before, going to a classroom and laying each poem on a desk. Going to a big classroom, and you say you have 40 seats. You put each poem on the top of a desk. And then you start walking up and down the rows and saying, there's the first poem, there's the second poem, there's the third poem. And you do that, and you put the manuscript together, and you think, hey, and you read it and you say, oh, that's really good, or that's not quite right. And you lay them all out again. Lay them all out again, and you say, okay, that's the first poem, that's the second one. And you try it until you really feel that there's both a dialogue between the poems, as well as a sense of movement from the beginning of the manuscript to the end, the sense that something has been learned, that there's a particular kind of travel that has taken place. In other words, I certainly, as with a short story or with a novel, if your reader feels the same way at the beginning that they do at the end, you really haven't done much, I don't think. So you're hoping that there's a sense that both intellectually and emotionally, the reader has traveled and they see something or understand something, perhaps of the poems that they didn't see at first, through the relationships that have developed over the manuscript, over the course of the manuscript. But more importantly, that they begin to feel, for me, ideally, that the reader begins to feel more and more that their own lives have been addressed in a variety of ways. This is not to say that they've lived your life, but that I like to imagine that people are not so different. And so that my life, for example, in Fast Animal, I'm doing a lot of reflecting on being a teenager. Well, everyone's who's an adult has been a teenager. And so you like to think that there are moments when they will see their own memories in various ways addressed. That's the ideal thing. And so you hope that throughout the course of the manuscript, something deepens, something is remembered that was otherwise forgotten. This is the way in which you like to think that poems, though they're personal to the poet, of course, they're also in various ways connected to the reader's life if you've done your work. And that's my feeling, that if the reader feels no connection to your work, either they're a bad reader or you have not done the work that's required to make a poetry book engaging and moving. Didn't mean to go on so long, but
no, that's so interesting. I'm curious, as you do that process, as you look at it, you see the book emerging that way. Do you ever find yourself say writing a poem or trying to create a poem that's basically connective tissue? In other words, to say, I kind of need something here. And
it's funny that's a relatively rare experience for me. I have had moments when I'm working, I'm late in a manuscript, and I'm thinking, I really like this manuscript, and I think it's complete. And, but you're still hovering in some uncertainty. And then perhaps I'll be sitting alone somewhere. One time this happened, I was taking a flight somewhere, maybe to a reading, I don't know. And on the way back, a poem came to me, and I realized this poem is really important to the manuscript, but I didn't approach the poem that way. I didn't think initially, I'm looking for a poem for the manuscript. I just thought, I think this one really belongs, So I think for the most part, I haven't written many poems. I'm trying to think of any that I've written particularly to connect. I'm not sure I've ever written a poem like that, but I hope that I'm patient enough that something that's missing will reveal itself to me. That's why I'm not sorry that it takes me about 5 years or thereabouts to write a book, because during that time, you develop a kind of intimacy with the whole text. And if there's something that's absent, I like to think it would be revealed to you as you go over it and over it again, If I was trying to finish a book in a year, I'm not sure I could do that. I mean, that's me now. There are people who may have a different kind of intuition. But I like that if I'm with a book long enough, I start to really feel its wholeness or its lack of wholeness. And then something will emerge that will allow me to say, okay, now I've got the whole body of this book. But I don't think I've yet written a poem specifically to fill a gap. I'm not sure I've ever done that.
I think of the reason I bring this up, Tim, is because certainly Fast Animal and One Turn Around the Sun are both highly radiant books in the sense that they seem deeper and longer than the page count. And I'm trying to kind of get to that notion. And it seems like one of the element of time, the element of saying this is not going to be a year's process, because I'd be truncating the part of the process where the poems start to teach me. I can think of W.D. Snodgrass saying, your poems have to be smarter than you are.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the characteristics of your work, especially that while it's lyrical, it also has some narrative thrum going on there, so that when we read a book of yours, it seems to have a special characteristic, and it seems to have a novelistic kind of range and breadth.
Well, that's what I hope for. I hope that a book of poems, my poems, would be approachable in the way someone might approach a novel or a set of stories. I like to think, of course, that the poems do things that prose cannot, but I also like to think that I put a lot of value on readability. I don't really want people to read my poems and think, ooh, deep. I don't want that. I want people to feel that they've been addressed. Stephen Dunn talked about how a poem can speak to us crucially. So I like to think that my poems might speak crucially to someone, and that has to be realized through clarity. and no tricks, no smoke and mirrors, just like, you hope the language is rich. You hope you're doing things with language that is surprising and imaginative and so on. But I'm not trying to outsmart my reader. I'm not trying to be clever. I want to hopefully, through the sheer intensity of discourse, have there be a real relationship or something real that develops between the book and the reader. That's my dream anyway. So that's how I like to think about the whole manuscript, and that's how I think about individual poems as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, now that kind of brings us to this new challenge that's forthcoming in 2021. We're going to see a new and selected poems, which will consist obviously of new poems and also selections from all of your past work.
All the books, yeah.
And I'm curious, like, how do you approach that holistically? Is it a record? Is it going to have the kind of arc that we've talked about in individual books? It seems like a higher bar to jump over.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the way I'm thinking about it, and of course I'm very early in the process. I mean, who knows? People may say, this is terrible. You've got to start over again. But the idea would be that each book represented in the selected would have some sense of the arc of that book. And then that the whole selected collection would be the thing I would hope that would be realized is that there's I hope a steady deepening of my own understanding of composition, my own understanding of language, my own understanding of my life and how it connects to other lives. So I wouldn't say that it would be the kind of arc I would try to develop in a single collection, but I would like to think there'd be a number of smaller arcs representing each book that would then represent a larger like swing of perspective or something, like how the poet I was when I was writing Body Moves, for example. I was in my late mid-20s into my early 30s. Well, that's a long time ago now, and so I like to think that in addition to seeing something interesting in those early poems, that by the time someone got to the end of the selected, if someone were so bold as to read the whole damn thing, that they would say, oh, I see roots of these poems in that first book, but the writing is of a different level, and I hope a better level, of course, than it was then. But my, for example, my interest in memory, looking back at my life and trying to weigh various memories in terms of how their impact on my own sense of things and my sense of my own being. Like that'll be throughout the book. I've always been writing about something I remembered. There are other things too. I have a political current probably in every book. So you'd like to think that someone who read the selected cover to cover would say, okay, this is one kind of political poem, but by the time 30 years later, he's writing a political poem that's more complex, that involves a deeper understanding of the political situation, the socio-political situation in the country. Also, maybe a deepening sense of introspection in some of the poems. You'd like to think that there would be, as I've gotten older as a writer, that there's more reflection going on that's directed inwardly. So I'd like to think that might be something someone would see developing throughout the arc of a selected, as you move from Body Moves, all the way to One Turn Around the Sun, you'd like to think that there's a sense both of a deepening grasp of language itself, but also a deepening grasp of the predicament of being a person. I don't think that at 64 the way I thought at 27. I just don't. I loved being 27, but part of the beauty of that period is a kind of blissful blindness about many things. As you get older, it's harder to not see. And I see much more now than I did then. And I hope that becomes apparent through the course of the book.
Right. In terms of poetry, Tim, not only is it a practice and an art that is reflected in the variety of publications that you've made, but it's also a kind of way of life. You've been a teacher at Old Dominion University for many years. You've taught before that in a variety of contexts, poets in the schools. You've been in the community. You've been the poet laureate of Virginia. Being out in the world and occupying that space. And then I want to ask you about that, and then I want to move on to talk about how literary citizenship, what it's meant to you in terms of some of the things you've done, including be a judge for the very award that you were a finalist of, which is the National Book Award. But tell me how your life as a poet, as a teacher, interacting with other people and with other poets has impacted your sense of this deepening understanding.
Yeah, well, I think one of the best things about teaching writing or young poets or even graduate level poets, I think one of the best things about it is that you have to remember some of the fundamental things that drove you into the practice. Because I think if you're working alone, like say I never taught at all, and I just wrote, I might write some good poems still, but I think whenever you have to look at a younger writer who has some questions that for you are already answered, you already think, well, of course I understand this and this, I don't think about that anymore. But when you have to call those things up and say, oh, of course, an enjambed line would do this as opposed to an in-stop line, which is something I don't think about. I just know, But when you talk about it, sometimes it can make you rethink other ideas about the line. It can make you, sharpen your mind again. You can say, because I think it's very easy to over assume what you know. And I'm not sure that's a real word, but yeah, I think it's easy to think you know more than you do. That is what I mean to say. And so I think when you're teaching, sometimes you're reminded of areas areas that you struggled with as a much younger writer, and it can remind you to look more carefully at certain kinds of things in your own work. It can also be, as you know, you're also a person who writes and teaches. It can also be a little exhausting because you may have found yourself saying some things, 100 times, the same thing. You think, I just don't want to talk about specificity ever again, But beyond that, there are moments when you're reminded of certain maybe craft things that you maybe have become slightly inattentive towards, or maybe more importantly, you see in the eyes of students the kind of passion and interest and maybe fear that you had once about, can I do this? Can I actually write like, Amiri Baraka, Mark Strand, Anne Sexton, and Pablo Neruda? Can I do that? They have all this amazing stuff. Can I do it? And you want to do it, but you're not sure you can do it. And when you see that in someone's eyes, a younger writer's eyes, I think it's helpful it's just a good reminder of where you've come and how far you've come as a thinking person and as a writer. And I use that, it's a kind of fuel for me, I would say. But with regard to larger issues of literary citizenship, about being a judge of work, boy, I found judging the National Book Award really, really agonizing. That is the truth. I've judged other contests that I've felt less anguish about, but the National Book Award, there were, in my mind, easily 30 books that could have won the year I was the judge, easily 30, if not 50, in my mind. It just depends on sometimes the mood in which you read the book? Are you tired when you read the book? You know? And the same would be true for the other four judges, the other four judges that were on the committee with me. Were the books that they dismissed, did they dismiss them because they were not as good as they should have been, or because they were exhausted when they read them? Because there's a lot of books to read. There's a lot. And so you just feel bad. As I read through many, and some, obviously think, well, this book, I'm not moved by. I don't find this book the one that I would like to award, such a title to. But there were many of all kinds that I thought were really good, some of which made it to the finals the year I was a judge. Some of the books I really liked made it. But certainly the books, some books that I really loved didn't, and I'm sure that was true of all the judges. And I think it's just kind of painful. I find, I just think it's, you just realize that there's a degree of luck involved. The best book, you like to think whatever books become finalists or whichever book wins are really deserving. Now, I'm not saying that. I would never deny that. I think we picked some good books, and I think the year, the book that won the year I was judging was, I think the title was Voyage of the Sable Venus, I believe. And I think it's a really good book, But as I was saying, any of the other books that were finalists certainly could have won. And there were a number of books on the long list that could have won. And then there are books that didn't make the long list that I think also could have won. There were a lot of good books, I thought. I find that painful. I think, of course, we have to make such decisions if there's going to be awards. If we're going to have awards, someone's got to decide who gets them. But I find it kind of agonizing to have to say yes to one collection and no to others that might be absolutely as worthy, But that's part of the life of a writer. And if you've been lucky enough to be successful, and successful enough that someone wants you to judge something like the National Book Award, then you can't be upset that you're doing the work. It's just part of it. It's like writing blurbs, for example, which I'm sure you've had to do. You write blurbs because when I was a younger writer, I wanted someone to blurb my book, so, I get older and people think my name means something and they ask. In most cases, I will say yes. I will try to write them a blurb. You just hope you write them a good one. I hate to write them a blurb that is inconsequential or fluff. But that's just part of the life, I think, of a writer. You've been given a lot by people who are generous-hearted, so you try to return that, to the larger writing community.
Tim, the interesting thing too, in regard to this whole kind of holistic view of being, a poet, looking at text, looking at words, doing readings, and then moving beyond to include other people's work, students, your colleagues, submitting to contests and things like that. And you've done something that's even kind of moves us away from or beyond the book as text, in the sense you've been involved deeply with the making of covers for the book. And in fact, as we were chatting beforehand, we talked about the fact that you have a lovely mural. And maybe tell us a little bit about how that interaction takes place. In particular, I think the most recent One Turn Around the Sun was a wonderful story that I'd love you to share.
Yeah. Anyway, I love the physicality of poetry books. And part of what I love about poetry books are the covers. I mean, I've always liked to look at covers. It's not unlike to me how back in our younger days, album covers were a big deal. Remember album covers?
Sure.
Big album covers. Oh, this looks so cool or whatever, And so I think my interest in book covers is probably connected to my delight in album covers growing up. So when I've written a collection, I'm thinking in various ways about how I would like how I would like a prospective reader to first make contact with that material. And the first thing they're going to see in most cases is the cover. They might see a poem from the manuscript in, in a magazine, or they might run into it on a website or something. But when they're thinking about the book itself, actually touching the book itself, when they pull it off the shelf, they're going to see a cover. And so I like to think about what kind of image feels like it's connected to the body of work in there. Now, and it's by no means a logical process. It's intuitive and a felt understanding of things. So, I had finished One Turn Around the Sun, and you don't know what you're exactly looking for. There's no way I could think, I have in mind this image. I don't have any images in mind. I just think when I see it, I'll know it, And so I was in Washington, D.C., and Jennifer, my beloved girlfriend, who has spent a lot of time on the African continent, said, "Oh, let's go to the Smithsonian Museum of African Art." And I'd never been, and I thought, well, sure, why not? Goodness gracious. No excuse for me to be just live in ignorance all my life. So we walk into the Smithsonian, and basically a few steps from the entrance is this huge three mats, I don't know what you call it, but in three sections, this huge image of a man, with his arms out extended like that, but it's huge. It's bigger than life. It's larger than a human being, but it's huge, and it's obviously riffing off a few different other images in the world. And as soon as I saw it, I said, that's the cover. That's it right there. And of course, I'm thinking to myself right after that, how am I ever going to get this to be on the cover of my book? The artist is from Africa. Lord knows if he speaks a language that I could speak to him back in, which it turns out that he really didn't. He speaks French and a number of other African languages, but I speak none of them. But Jennifer did. He speaks French and can write in French. And so we asked some people at the museum, and we got, his information, and Jennifer emailed him an email in French, and, oh, there's a poet, and he'd love to have this work, on his book cover. And it, a while went by. I just figured out the guy's never going to answer. We're just out of luck. And then out of nowhere, we get this response. And the artist says, "You look like my brother," to her in French. She sent him a picture of me, and he sends back a response, "He looks like my brother." So he can do whatever he wants with the image. And that's how it happened. He didn't even ask for a penny for that image. Yeah. He just said, "Hey, take it," And now we've been trying to find out where he is so we can send him a copy of the book. It's been 3 years. It'd be nice if we could, but we haven't been able to get it to him. But yeah, that's how it happened. I'm sorry that we went on a while, but yeah, it was very strange. But that moment when I saw the image, I just thought, that's it, I mean, in addition to the fact that I love it on its own terms, I just thought it would be cool to have it on a book cover,
Anyway. Well, Tim, maybe we could end if you share a poem from One Turn Around the Sun.
Okay,
sure. Poem and then.
Absolutely, I would love to. And you can, of course, edit this as you would. I'm sorry to ramble. I think I'm losing my mind. I've been inside too much. I'm losing my mind. Let me see. All right, how about I'm sorry, Phil. How about I'll read Eightball. Why not? This book is in many ways a portrait of my family, among other things, but it's also. So this is called Eightball. My father was not amazing at pool. Sighting along the stick, he would stare down the cue as if some stout albino animal had paused on the green. Then he'd shoot and scatter the others, the lucky ones disappearing. I probably beat him as much as he beat me. All the welts from his parenting, quietly driving my shots. Sometimes when he was feeling it, he'd hit a banker, the 5-ball bending back soft into the side pocket, and the pride on his face shimmered like summer heat rising from asphalt. It was usually early evening. My mother in the kitchen with Walter Cronkite chalking up the news on CBS as though his solemn delivery could set up some better headlines. At the time, of course, I just wanted to win. Didn't think about what those whoopings meant or why he used that old ironing cord. But I did crave a little revenge, hoped to even the score somehow, especially when my late teens found muscles rallying under my skin. I really thought I could go toe to toe with him, get in some good shots, show him what it meant to be overpowered and afraid. I had gotten a lot taller by then and probably might have taken him down. Some days he'd say, "Shut up." And I felt like a young god done wrong by this dumb dad, his thick mustache, his good gray slacks, who said he knew me like the back of his hand. And my veins were racked with adrenaline ready to help me break the whole damn house. But my pop was often a shy man who wouldn't raise his voice to my mom. He joined the church chess club and stayed out of bars. Sometimes I'd see him alone in the living room, brass blasting from the stereo, a Marlboro cooking in his hand. And though he never said so, I think he would have loved making music, sang loud with a sax, what he could never fit into words. One time, he hit me, and I nearly fell into that glass table by the hi-fi. But he caught me, left me tracing the shock of his knuckles that for a few days defined the left side of my face. It couldn't have been easy coming home full of fury, the only Black biochemist at a government lab, shaking hands with all the extra shit he had to take. If my son had mouthed off, I like to believe I wouldn't have blacked his eye. I don't have any children, and no hideaway pool table that folds out from the back of a couch. So it's hard to get a clear shot at what might be true, with so many rough maybes sitting in the way. Still, I bet my father's life was a lot harder than mine. And I'm pretty sure he believed all he did was mostly exactly what he had to do.
Tim Seibles, thank you so much.
Hey man, it was great, Phil. I hope it was all right. I probably, if it went haywire, just say his brain was besieged by quarantine or whatever.
Well, we're all besieged, but this is a lightening of that quarantine. It's great to talk to you, Tim. And
yeah, man.
We'll see you on the other side.
Yes, indeed, sir. I sure hope so. Be
All
good,
right.
Phil.
Bye, Tim.
Later, man.